A debt does not feel like a number. It feels like a hand on the back of your neck, pushing your face down toward a ledger, and a man's voice reading out a price that is also your name. It tastes like sawdust and lamp oil and the copper of your own bitten tongue. She stood at the counter with her boots nailed to the floor by every eye in the room, and somewhere behind her a man said, "Calm as weighing flour, 60 in dust then for the both of them, and we'll call old Calloway's book square." The whole camp went quiet to hear it. A girl's hand found hers and held on. And then a different sound came through the door, the flat, heavy clap of a leather pouch hitting the planks, and a voice scraped low under the silence, smelling even there of wet hide and pine pitch. Paid, rewind. 3 weeks before they tried to sell her, the woman who would owe a stranger her freedom and despise him for it was kneeling in frozen ground at the edge of a rotting silver camp called Cold Forge, packing the last shovelful of dirt onto her husband's grave with her bare hands because she could not bear to hear it land off the blade. Her name was Ruth Calloway, and she was 23 years old, and she had come west 2 summers gone as a bride with a trunk of fine thread and a head full of a clean cabin and a creek that ran clear. What she had instead was a mounded grave, a 12-year-old sister the fever had spared, and a debt she did not know existed yet, ticking away in another man's book like a clock she could not hear. Cold Forge was less a town than a wound somebody had cut into the flank of the Bitterroot Range and refused to let close. False front saloons leaned drunk over a street of mud and crushed quartz, a mercantile with a high counter, an assay office, a row of company shacks where the diggers slept 4 to a room, and above it all, on the good ground, the big plank house of the man who owned the note on nearly every soul in the camp. His name was Silas Drew, and he had grubstaked half the claims on the creek, which is to say he had advanced the powder and the beans and the picks against a share of whatever came out of the rock, and he kept the accounting himself, in a thick leather ledger the storekeeper guarded like a man guards a dog he beats. Daniel Calloway had taken Drew's grubstake the first winter, the way every hopeful fool in Cold Forge took it, and had worked a thin seam up a side gulch that finally, the week before the fever took him, had begun to show color, real silver, a proved claim. Daniel had ridden down sick and joyful to file it. He had filed it. And then the throat fever that came up the creek every thaw had taken him in 9 days, and Ruth had buried him, and she had thought, in her grief, that the worst had already happened. She did not understand yet how a debt outlives the man who signed it, and how a proved claim is a thing that men will kill for, and how a widow with no money and a child to feed is, to a certain kind of man, simply the last unbalanced line in a book that he intends to balance. She found out on a Friday. The summons came as a boy with a note, then as 2 of Drew's men at her shack door, polite as undertakers, saying Mr. Drew required her at the mercantile to settle her late husband's account. She went because in a company camp you do not refuse the man who owns the company, and she took Nell because she would not leave her 12-year-old sister alone in a camp full of idle diggers. That was the first mistake, though no choice she had that day was truly hers. The store was full. That was the second thing she understood, that it had been arranged to be full, that a thing meant to look lawful is always done in front of a crowd. Silas Drew stood at the end of the counter in a long black coat, lean and clean-shaven going to jowl, and beside him his storekeeper. A heavy florid man in a stained apron and a green eyeshade had the great ledger open to a page, and Drew laid one gloved finger on a line of it the way a man lays a card. "Your husband owed me $412 against the grubstake, Mrs. Calloway," he said, kindly, for the crowd. "Powder, tools, the beans that kept him alive to dig, it's all here, signed. A debt doesn't die just because the man does. Now you've no money, I'm told you've a trade." He let that sit. "Needlework, of no earthly use up here. But a woman who can work, and a girl near old enough to, that's worth something against a debt, isn't it?" 2 years of service, the both of you. Kitchen and laundry and what all, and we'll call the books square. I'm being generous. I could call in the law and have you bound over for the whole sum." He smiled. 60 and dust, he said to the storekeeper, as if naming a freight charge. "For the both of them, 2 years. And we'll call old Calloway's book square." And the storekeeper wrote it, and the crowd murmured, and Ruth Calloway felt the floor tilt the way it must tilt under a person on a gallows, because she understood that she was being sold. Here, in the daylight, in front of 40 men who would not meet her eye, and that the law Drew kept threatening was his law, bought and kept like everything else in Cold Forge, and that there was no number she could say, no column she could balance, that would carry her and her sister out of that store free. Nell's hand found hers and held on so hard it hurt. And that is when the door darkened, and a man came in out of the hard autumn light, who did not belong to Cold Forge or to any place that kept a ledger. He was a mountain of a man, long dark hair going gray at the temples and a full black beard, a heavy open coat of raw animal hide over a coarse undershirt, a sheathed knife at his belt, and he smelled, even from the door, of wet fur and pine pitch and wood smoke. The smell of the high country where Drew's paper meant nothing. He had come down for powder and salt and coffee, the way he came down twice a year and no more. And he had stood at the back of the crowd long enough to understand exactly what was being sold and to whom, and the diggers had stepped out of his way without quite knowing why. His name was Ezra Finch, and he did not say a word at first. He crossed the floor. He took from inside his coat a heavy worn leather pouch, the kind a man fills a grain at a time over a long season of cold work, gold dust panned and trapped and traded for over more solitary months than most of the crowd had been in the territory, and he set it down on the counter in front of the open ledger, not gently, a flat heavy clap of weight that made the lamp jump. "Paid," he said. The store went silent. Silas Drew looked at the pouch and looked at the man, and something behind his eyes did a swift cold sum. "This is a private account, friend," he said. "It doesn't concern, weigh it." Ezra Finch did not raise his voice. He had a voice that did not need raising, low and flat and scraped down to the grain, a voice that had spent a decade speaking mostly to the wind. "There's better than $400 of dust in that poke. Weigh it on your own scale, in front of your own crowd, and you write in your own book that the Calloway debt is paid in full, this day, by cash money. And then these two walk out that door, owing you nothing." He had not once looked at Ruth. That was the thing she would remember longest, longer than the gold, that he did not look at her, did not tip his battered hat, did not perform a single ounce of the chivalry that would have turned the moment into a man buying a woman's gratitude. He looked only at Silas Drew, and at the storekeeper, and at the scale. The storekeeper looked at Drew. Drew, with 40 witnesses watching and a mountain of a man's flat gray eyes on him, could do nothing but nod. Because a man who builds his power on the appearance of law cannot, in front of the whole camp, refuse cash money on a lawful debt. The scale came out. The dust was weighed. It went better than $430, and the storekeeper, with his jaw tight, wrote in the great ledger, in front of everyone, "Paid in full," and turned the book so the crowd could see it, because Ezra Finch stood there until he did. And then Ezra Finch put the few coins of change the storekeeper grudged him into his coat, and he picked up his sack of powder and salt and coffee, and he turned, and for the first time his eyes crossed Ruth Calloway's, one flat gray instant, and all he said was this: "You're free to go where you like. Camp's no place to winter with a child. And he walked out the door into the light and started down the rutted street without once looking back to see what she would do. Ruth stood frozen with her sister's hand crushing hers and the whole store staring. And into the silence Silas Drew said, soft, only for her, smiling still, a generous man. But debts have a way of opening back up. Mrs. Calloway, especially the ones a stranger thinks he's closed. She did not understand the threat then. She would. She took Nell's hand, and she walked out of that store on legs that did not feel like hers, into a daylight that felt obscene after what had happened in it. And she stood in the mud and watched the broad hide coated back of the man who had just spent a fortune to set two strangers free, growing smaller down the street. And the thing that rose up in her was not, God help her, gratitude. It was a hot black fury and a deeper, older terror, because Ruth Calloway had learned in 2 hard years that nothing in this world was free, that every kindness was a loan and every loan came due, and a man did not lay $400 of gold on a counter for 2 women he had never met and ask for nothing. A price was coming. A price always came, and owing was the one thing in the world she could not survive. So she did the only thing her pride would let her do. She gathered her skirts and her sister, and she went after him down the street to find out what she had been bought for. He did not slow when she caught up. That was the second true thing she learned about Ezra Finch after the not looking. He did not slow down for anyone, but he heard everything. "I'll pay you back," she said to his shoulder, half running to keep up, Nell stumbling along at her other hand. "Every grain. I don't know how, but I will. I won't be beholden to a stranger. Tell me what you want for it, and I'll. Don't want anything for it." He said it to the street ahead, not to her. It wasn't a loan, wasn't a purchase. "I won't be paid back, so don't try." "Then why?" she said, and her voice cracked on it, furious. "Why would a man do that?" He stopped. He turned, and he looked down at her, the scar splitting his left cheekbone pale in the weathered brown of his face, and at the girl gripping her hand, and something moved behind the flat gray of his eyes that was not warmth, exactly, but was the memory of where warmth had been. "Because I stood in the back of that store," he said, "and watched a room full of men decide a person was a number in a book, and not one of them stood up. I've seen what comes of letting men do their accounting on people. I won't watch it twice." He shifted the sack on his shoulder. "Where will you go?" It was not a question, the way he said it. It was a thing he was waiting on. And Ruth Calloway, standing in the mud of a camp that had just tried to sell her, with no money and no claim she could prove was hers, and a sick fear that Drew's smile had put in her chest, and winter 3 weeks off in the high passes, had no answer that was not a slower kind of dying. She lifted her chin. "I don't know," she said. "Not back there." Ezra Finch looked at the sky, and at the white already gathering on the high peaks, and at the girl, and he made a sound that was almost a sigh. "Camp's no place for either of you, and there's nowhere down low you can get to before the snow." He turned back up the street, toward the trail that climbed out of Cold Forge into the timber. "I've a cabin, an hour up and 4,000 feet. 1 room. It's warm, and the door bars from the inside. You can come till the passes open in the spring, and then you go where you want, free. Or you can stay here and find out what that man meant about debts opening back up." He started walking. "Your choice. I won't make it for you." They followed him. Of course they followed him. The alternative was a company shack and a smiling man who owned the law, but Ruth followed 3 steps behind, with Nell's hand in hers and her dead mother's thimble on its bootlace pressed cold against her sternum under her shawl. And she swore to herself with every step of the climb that, whatever this scarred silent giant wanted from her, she would find a way to pay it and be free, because being beholden was a thing she could not breathe under. The trail out of Cold Forge climbed hard. It switchbacked up through autumn timber, ponderosa and larch already half bare, the aspens gone to gold coin and dropping, and the higher they went the colder the air ran, and the first thin snow lay blue in the shadows of the rocks. Ezra Finch did not slow, but Ruth came to understand, mile by mile, that he never once let them out of his sight. When Nell flagged, he shortened his stride without a word and made a show of resettling the sack so the girl could catch her wind without being told she needed to. When Ruth slipped on a wet root and went down on one knee, he did not turn and offer a hand. He simply stopped and waited, his back to her, and went on only when he heard her boots take up the trail again. By the time the timber opened onto a high shelf of meadow backed by a granite cliff, the light had gone long and gold, and her legs had stopped belonging to her. And Nell was weaving on her feet. The cabin sat against the cliff the way a thing grows against a wall. One room, squat, built of fitted logs gone silver with weather, a stone chimney, a single shuttered window, a low door he had to duck through. A pole barn leaned beside it, and under the eave a line of stretched pelts hung curing, beaver and marten and one great cinnamon bear hide. And the smell of them, and of the wood smoke, and the rendered tallow was the smell that had come off the man in the store, and Ruth understood that she was walking into the inside of him. He pushed the door open and stood aside. "Stove's there," he said. "Get the girl warm. Don't touch the rifle." And that was the whole of his welcome. Inside it was dim and close and astonishingly warm where the banked stove still breathed. A rope bed with a straw tick and gray blankets along one wall, a plank table, 2 stumps for chairs, a shelf of tins, a hanging slab of bacon, strings of dried apple, and on the wall, in a graded row, his traps, iron and oiled, each in its place, and his rifle, a lever-action Winchester, cleaned and resting on 2 pegs, and Ruth understood from the order of the place the same thing she would later understand about the man, that this was someone who kept his dangerous things exactly where his hand could find them in the dark. He built up the fire without taking off his coat. He set a pot of water to heat, and he took down a tin of stewed venison and a heel of dark bread, and set them on the table near the girl, not handing them over, just setting them where a hungry child could reach without having to ask. And then he took his bedroll down off a peg and carried it toward the door, out to the barn, and over his shoulder, flat as a man stating the weather, he said the thing that began, against all her armor, to undo her. "I won't touch either of you. Door bars from the inside. Bar it if it sits easier." And he went out and pulled the door to behind him and left a widow and a child alone in a warm room with food they had not paid for and a heavy oak bar they were welcome to throw against him. Ruth did not eat at first. She sat Nell down by the stove and watched the girl fall on the bread, and she herself sat rigid on the edge of the strange bed and waited for the catch, the price, the moment the door would open again on different terms. It did not come. She heard him out in the barn, the soft sounds of a big man bedding down in straw among animals, the low complaint of a goat, the shift of a horse. After a long while, when the warmth had got far enough into her bones that her pride could no longer hold it off, she ate. The bread was dense and good, the venison was rich with rendered fat, and she barred the door, not against him, she told herself, but because barring it was a thing she could do, one small coin of control in a day that had spent everything else. And she lay down with Nell in a stranger's gray blankets that smelled of pine and smoke. And the last thing she thought before the dark took her was that she still did not know the name of the man who had bought her freedom and refused to be paid for it. If you've ever lain awake in a stranger's house, certain that the kindness shown you must be a trap because the world has only ever taught you that kindness is, then you already know the country Ruth Calloway was traveling that night, and you know it is colder than any mountain. Stay with me up here a while, because that is the country this whole channel was built to map. The steep frozen distance between being owned and being chosen, and how the hardest people on God's earth sometimes carry each other across it. Subscribe and keep the notifications on, because the lamps always lit up here at Timberline Hearts, and there's another soul climbing out of the cold every week. She learned his name the next morning, and not much else. He came in from the barn with goat's milk warm in a tin cup and set it by Nell and said, "Drink that. You both lost heat on the climb. Name's Ezra, if you need to call me something." She told him hers, and her sister's. He nodded once, as though filing the words where they belonged, and that was the whole of their first real conversation. The days that followed taught her the shape of his silence, which was not empty but full, the way deep timber is full. He rose before light. He ran a trap line that took him hours up the drainages, and she would watch his dark, patient shape go out through the bare trees and come back at dusk with the day's catch frozen stiff over his shoulder. He skinned and fleshed and stretched by the barn in the cold blue evenings, hands sure and quick, and the cabin filled with the green smell of hides and the tallow he rendered in a great iron kettle. He spoke to them only in instructions. Drink from the spring, not the low creek. Wood split small in the left rick burns hot for cooking. If anything comes into the yard on 4 legs or 2, you get inside and you bar the door and you do not come out for me. Never a word that could be mistaken for tenderness, and underneath every flat instruction the same thing: here is how you stay alive. It made her furious, and she could not have explained the fury to a living soul. His refusal to name a price, his refusal even to be thanked, was itself a kind of debt that grew by the day, compounding like interest, and she had no way under heaven to discharge it. On the 4th morning, she could not stand it. She got up before he did and built the fire and put on the pot, and when he came in from the barn stamping the cold off his boots, she stood up straight with her chin high and said hard, "We'll earn our keep. I'm not a charity case, and neither's my sister. Tell me what work pays for what you did, and we'll do it. All of it." She had meant it to sound like strength. It came out closer to begging. Ezra Finch looked at her a long moment, and the scar on his cheekbone caught the firelight, and what he said was so quiet she nearly missed it. "Stop trying to pay me back." He set down the brace of marten he carried. "I told you in the store. It wasn't a ledger. You start keeping accounts on a thing like that, it never balances, and you'll spend your whole life cold inside trying to make it. I've watched it happen to better people than me. So stop." It was the most words she had yet had from him, and the nearest to anger she would ever see him come, which is to say his voice dropped lower and his hands went still. "If you want to work because the work needs doing, then work, and welcome, but not to pay me. That I won't take." It should have freed her. Instead, it cracked something open. Because Ruth Calloway had spent her whole life believing that love was a transaction and kindness alone, that her own worth was the sum of what her hands could provide, and here was a scarred, half-wild stranger telling her that the largest thing anyone had ever done for her could not be bought back, was simply hers, free. A thing she would have to learn to carry instead of repay. She turned to the stove so he would not see her face. "Then I'll work because it needs doing," she said to the iron. And she did. What her hands could not do at first, she learned. Her seamstress's hands, soft and nimble and quick with a needle, the hands that had once drawn fine white lace out of nothing across a long winter for her own wedding, were useless and worse than useless that first week. She burned them on the kettle. She laid the heel of her thumb open to the bone, learning the skinning knife. She raised blisters that broke and bled on the maul handle, and at night she could not close her fingers. Ezra did not coddle her, and he did not mock her. When she cut herself, he washed it with spirit that made her hiss and bound it with a strip of clean flannel and said only, "Knife works toward the bone, not toward your hand. Turn the blade." When the maul bounced off a round and nearly took her shin, he set the round up on a higher block and showed her once the swing that lets the weight of the iron do the work instead of the shoulder. And then he went back to his own labor and let her fail at it until she didn't. By the 8th day, she could split a rick of stove wood without weeping. By the 2nd week, her hands had begun to harden, the soft pads going to callous, and she caught herself one evening turning her own cracked palms over in the firelight with something she had no word for, a fierce, ugly pride. And across the cabin she felt him notice it, and neither of them said a thing. Nell did not stay idle, and this was the first thing that made Ruth begin, despite herself, to trust the man. A lesser household would have set a 12-year-old in the corner to be fed and fretted over. Ezra Finch handed the girl work the second morning, real work, the small fiddling labor that mattered, and watched her find her feet in it. She learned to feed and bank the stove so it held a coal until dawn. She took over the milk goat and the 3 hens, and the goat that would let no one else near it without a fight took to the girl at once and followed her around the yard like a dog. He taught Nell to set the little brass wire snares for snowshoe hair along the willow runs below the cabin, and to read which runs were used and which were old, and within a week she was bringing in 2 and 3 hairs a day and skinning them clean at the block with her tongue between her teeth, and keeping the household's tally of meat and wood and stores in a child's careful hand on the back of a flour sack because she had her sister's head for figures and nowhere else to put it. "Girl's worth her keep twice over," Ezra said once, watching Nell drive the goat in ahead of a squall, and it was the only unguarded warmth Ruth had yet heard out of him, and she hoarded it. On the 14th morning, he handed Ruth the skinning knife without a word and stepped back, and she understood it for the test it was, a thing he would not name and would not soften. She set the marten on the fleshing board the way she had watched him do it 100 times, and she made the first cut wrong, too deep, and ruined a strip of belly fur that had been worth real money. She waited for him to take the knife back. He did not. "Again," he said, and turned a second carcass toward her, and let her ruin that one too, and a third less so. And by the 4th, her hands had found the angle that lifts the hide off the meat in one clean peeling pull, and she looked up, and he had already gone back to his own work, which was the only praise the man knew how to give, and the truest she had ever had. She learned the iron economy of the place that way, one ruined thing at a time. She learned that a marten rubbed against the willow was worth nothing, and a marten handled clean was worth a week of coffee and salt, that the cold came up through the floorboards before it ever came under the door, that a fire banked right at night would still hold a coal at dawn, that you set a trap so it took the animal quick instead of slow, because Ezra would not abide a slow death even in the things he killed to live, and that single fact told her more about the man than any confession could have. Weeks bled into one another, measured by the shrinking stack of stove wood and the growing stack of cured pelts and the snow creeping a little lower down the peaks each dawn. And somewhere in the ordinary brutal arithmetic of staying alive beside him, Ruth Calloway stopped flinching when he came through the door, and Ezra Finch stopped carrying his rifle from the wall to the barn and back, and 2 people who had each long ago decided they would do their dying alone began, without once saying so, to do their living next to someone else. It was the lace that nearly broke her. One black night in the 4th week, she had taken it out of the bottom of the carpet bag where it lived wrapped in oilcloth, a folded square of fine white lace, half finished, the most beautiful thing her hands had ever made, and the only thing she had carried west that was purely for love and not for use. She had begun it the winter Daniel courted her, meaning to wear it at her own wedding, and she had not finished it in time. And then They were married in a plain dress in a plain church, and she had told herself she would finish it for their first child. There had been no child yet. And now there was a grave. She sat by the stove with the unfinished lace in her ruined hands, the delicate threads snagging on her new calluses, and she found she could not make the stitches her fingers had known by heart at 16. That this country had taken even that from her. And she put her face down into the lace and wept for her husband for the first time since she had packed the dirt onto him with her hands, deep and ugly and silent so as not to wake the girl. She did not hear Ezra come in. He had a tread like a cat for a man so big. He stood in the dark a moment, and he did not touch her, and he did not tell her it would be all right, because he was not a man who told useful lies. He went to the shelf and took down a small flat packet she had not known he kept, and he set it on the table near her, the way he set everything, where she could reach it without being handed it. "Found this in your husband's account at the store," he said quietly. "Storekeeper had it in the ledger box. It's yours. Should have given it you before." And he went out again to the barn. It was a letter, Daniel's letter, the last one, that he had written down at the assay office the week before the fever took him, and never had the chance to send up the gulch to her because he had ridden home to tell her in person, and arrived already sick. She knew his hand. She lit the tallow dip and she read it, and her husband's voice came up off the cheap paper as clear as if he sat across the stove, eager and boyish and full of a future that had not come. The seams proved, Ruthie, he had written, real silver, an honest vein, enough to pay off Drew's grubstake 3 times over and buy us the clean place with the creek I promised you. I filed it proper. It's ours. It's in your name too, so you're safe whatever comes. Finish your lace, girl. We're going to need it. I mean to give you the wedding you should have had. And then a line that stopped her heart. Don't ever let that man tell you we owe him more than money. We don't owe Silas Drew our lives. Nobody owns us. Ruth Calloway sat in the lamplight with her dead husband's voice in her hands and the unfinished lace in her lap, and she understood 2 things at once that would change everything that came after. The first was that Daniel had filed the claim in both their names, that the proved silver up the gulch was legally, provably hers, and that this was the real reason a smiling man had tried to turn her into a number in a book, not the grubstake debt at all, which had only ever been the lever. The second was simpler and went deeper. We don't owe Silas Drew our lives. Nobody owns us. Her husband had written it about a creditor, but she was reading it in the cabin of a man who had spent a fortune to make exactly that true, who had refused from the first hour to own her, and for the first time the thing she felt toward Ezra Finch was not the hot debt fury she had been nursing for weeks. It was something quieter and far more frightening. She folded the letter away with the lace, and she did not finish the stitches that night. But she did not put the lace back in the bottom of the bag either. She left it out, on the shelf, where the daylight could find it. If you've made it this far into Ruth's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. The snow came down for good the 3rd week of cohabitation and sealed them in, and then it tried to kill them. It started gentle, the way the worst storms do. A soft gray morning with the flakes drifting big and lazy, and Nell laughing in the yard, and Ezra stood in the cabin door and looked at the sky a long while, and did not laugh. "Bring the goat in," he said, "and the hens. We won't see the barn again for a few days." Ruth thought it was caution. By nightfall she understood it was prophecy. The wind came up out of the high passes after dark, and it did not blow so much as lean, a steady killing weight of it that found every gap in the chinking, and stood the candle flame sideways, and the soft snow turned to a fine dry powder. The wind drove flat and packed against the north wall until it climbed the logs. They woke the second morning to a window gone blue-black, with drift and a door they could open only 6 inches. And Ezra dug them out through that gap, an hour of brutal work just to clear a path to the woodpile, and came back inside gray to the lips and would not let Ruth see how hard he was breathing. The cold that came behind the wind was not weather. It was a presence, patient and personal, that pressed in on the little room from every side and waited for one mistake. The stove that had kept them warm now barely held the chill back from the center of the floor, and the woodpile she had split and stacked with her own ruined hands, and thought endless began to shrink at a rate that frightened her the moment she let herself count it. "We'll go short," she said low, that second night so Nell wouldn't hear, and it was not a question. Ezra looked at her across the firelight, and she saw him decide not to lie to her, and she understood that this too was a kind of respect she had never been given before, the respect of the true number. "We'll go short," he agreed. 3 days, 4, we're fine. A week, we burn the barn rails and then the table, and then we're in trouble. I've wintered worse, not with 2 more mouths and a fire that can't go cold. So they burned it careful, letting the fire die to a hard-worked coal by day, and crawling the 3 of them under every blanket and the great cinnamon bear hide. And Ezra taught Nell, who was frightened, the trapper's trick of it, that 3 bodies under one hide hold a heat no stove alone can give. The girl fell asleep between the 2 adults with the goat against her back, and Ruth lay awake on the far side listening to the wind try the door, and felt, for the first time in 2 years, something she was almost afraid to name as safety. On the 4th day, the cold broke a thing it had been working at all along. Ezra went out at first light for an armload of the dwindling wood, and he was gone too long, and Ruth, who had learned to read the silences of that place, knew it in her stomach and was pulling on his spare coat before she had finished the thought. She found him 40 feet from the door, down on one knee in the drift, the side of his head dark with blood where a falling slab of ice from the eave had caught him, his eyes gone unfocused and slow. A blow like that on a summer afternoon is a headache. A blow like that at 30 below, with a man already worn thin from a week of digging and short rations and giving his own warmth to a child, is a death sentence that has not yet been carried out. She did not panic. The woman who had stood frozen in a store while men sold her did not freeze now. In those weeks of being handed the knife and let to fail and made to learn, a different woman had been built inside the old one without her noticing. She got under his arm. He was twice her weight and going to dead weight. So she did not try to lift him. She braced and leaned and made him walk on the legs that still half worked, talking the whole way in the flat, steady voice she had learned from him. "You keep your feet under you. You do not get to quit on this snow. One more, until the door was there and Nell was holding it, and the 2 of them got the great slack mountain of him over the sill and onto the bunk. And then Ruth Calloway did the thing he had done for her without being taught, because love and terror together are the fastest teachers there are. She built the fire up high, higher than they could afford, and did not count the wood, because some nights the arithmetic has to wait. She got the wet, frozen coat and boots off him and pressed the cold flesh of his hands and feet against her own warm belly, the way he had taught Nell, hissing at the icy shock of him, and sent Nell to heat stones and pack them in flannel around his sides, and cleaned the gash on his head, and bound it tight, and through the long, terrible middle of that night, when his teeth chattered so hard, she was afraid he'd break them, and then, far worse, when they stopped and he went quiet, and still in the way she knew from her own husband's last hours, meant the cold had got down into the deep machinery of him. She got into the bunk and put her whole body the length of his and held him. And she talked. She had never talked so much in her life. She told him about Daniel and the lace, and about the fury she had felt at him for saving her. And she told him in the blackest part of that night with no one to hear but a half-dead man, the thing she had not let herself think in words, that she did not want to be free of him in the spring, that the door she barred every night was barred to keep the world out now and not him, and that the awful joke of it was that the man who had spent a fortune to make sure she owed him nothing could have had everything she owned if he had only once asked. He did not wake to hear it, but sometime in the gray hours his breathing lengthened and eased, and the deadly stillness gave way to ordinary sleep, and his big scarred hand, somewhere under the bear hide, found hers and closed on it, and whether he knew he did it, she never learned, and she lay with her face against the back of his neck and felt the exact moment the man stopped dying. He came back slow over 2 days, foul-tempered and ashamed to be tended, too weak to fight her when she would not let him up. And in those 2 days, with the roles turned around, the silence between them, that full-timbered silence she had spent 6 weeks learning to read, finally cracked open, and they talked. He told her about the war, a little, the way men of that generation told it, in fragments around the edges of a thing too big to look at straight. And he told her he'd had a wife once, in another life, in Ohio, dead of childbed fever with the child, and that he had come west afterward to a country that asked nothing and gave nothing back, and had told himself he was content, which he had since learned was a different animal than being it. "I quit on people," he said, his voice rusty with disuse and fever. "Decided it was cleaner. You don't owe and you're not owed. You don't bury anybody and nobody buries you. I had it worked out. Then I came down for salt and there was a room full of men selling a woman, and I had the gold in my coat, and I told myself I'd settle the wrong and go back up the mountain and be done." He was quiet a moment. "I'm not done with it," he said. "I haven't been done with it since the store. That's the truest thing I've got to give you, and it scares me worse than the cold did." Ruth Calloway looked at the man who had refused to own her even when she begged him to, and understood that what frightened her now was not the debt. It was that there had never been a debt at all, only two ruined people each waiting for the other to name a price, and that the thing growing in that cabin was the one kind she had never once been offered. Free. The storm blew itself out on the 7th day and left the world remade, white and blinding and savagely still. The drifts curled like frozen surf against the timber and the peaks so sharp against the blue they looked cut from tin. They had made it. The barn rails were burned, and the table had a leg gone into the stove. But they were alive, all three, and the goat and the hens. And on the first clear morning, Nell ran out into the dazzle and made an angel in the snow, while Ezra watched her from the door, heeling, leaning on the jamb, and Ruth stood beside him close enough that their arms touched and neither of them moved away. But debts have a way of opening back up. Ezra was strong enough to run a short line again by the 2nd week after the storm, and it was on the 3rd day of it, up a drainage he had not worked since the snow, that he found the stakes. Fresh-cut survey stakes, the wood still pale and bleeding sap, driven into the frozen ground at the corners of a claim, and a notice nailed to a blazed pine in a clerk's tidy hand. He read it a long time in the cold, then pulled it down and carried it back to the cabin and laid it on what was left of the table, and Ruth saw his face and knew the smiling man had not forgotten them. It was a notice of claim. It described, in the dry exact language of the law that Silas Drew kept like a dog, the proved silver seam up the side gulch above Cold Forge, the seam Daniel had filed in both their names. And it asserted that the said claim, being part of the estate of the late Daniel Calloway, and the said estate being encumbered by debts to one Silas Drew, which the widow Ruth Calloway had absconded to avoid, was forfeit, and was hereby relocated and filed by the said Silas Drew, and any party disputing was directed to appear before the camp recorder, which was to say before Drew's own bought clerk in Drew's own bought camp. Ruth read it twice, the way she read everything that frightened her, and the second time she stopped being afraid and started being something colder and more useful. He paid the debt off in front of 40 men, she said slowly, working it out aloud. Your gold. The book says paid in full. He made too big a show of the law to take me for the debt now, so he's doing the other thing, saying I ran before it was paid, that I'm a thief who skipped out, and a thief forfeits the estate, and the estate is the claim. She looked up. It was never about me or the $400. It was always the silver. The debt was just the rope he meant to hang the claim with, and you cut the rope in the store, so now he's twisting up a new one. Ezra Finch looked at her with something in his face she had not seen before, which was a kind of awe. How long, he said, have you had a head like that on you? My whole life, she said. Nobody ever asked to see it before. He was quiet. Then he said the thing she had been dreading and hoping for in equal measure. We can let it go. The claim. It's silver under a mountain. It's not worth dying over. And Drew's got the recorder and the deputy and a dozen men who owe him. You're free and clear of the debt that's on paper that he can't undo. We pack out over the saddle when the high snow firms in March, and we go down the far side into the Bitterroot Valley, where his paper means nothing. And we let him have his hole in the ground. Nobody gets shot over it. That's the smart play, and I'll back it if you say it. And Ruth Calloway stood in the wrecked warm cabin with her dead husband's last letter folded on the shelf beside her unfinished lace, and she heard Daniel's voice as clear as the day she'd read it. Nobody owns us. No, she said. The fire popped. Nell looked up from the corner. I have spent 2 years being a line in that man's book, Ruth said, and her voice did not shake. He decided what my husband was worth, and then what I was worth. $60 in dust in front of the whole camp, and now he's decided he can call me a thief and take the one thing Daniel left me that says I was ever anything but a debt to be settled. If I run over the saddle and let him have it, then for the rest of my life I am exactly the thing he wrote in his book. Free the way a thing is free that nobody bothered to chain because it already ran. I won't do it. That silver is in my name. Daniel put it there to keep me safe whatever came, and what came is Silas Drew. And I am going to go down that mountain and take it back in front of the same 40 men who watched him try to sell me. She stopped. Not for the silver, for the line in the book. I'm going to make him cross it out. For a long moment, Ezra Finch only looked at her. Then he did the thing that told her, more than any word could have, what they had become to each other across one hard winter. He did not argue, and he did not offer to do it for her, and he did not tell her to stay behind. He went to the wall and took down the rifle and a second one she had not known he owned, an old single shot kept oiled in a flour sack under the bunk. And he set them both on the table beside the forfeiture notice. Then we'd best make sure, he said. You're not the only one in that camp who isn't afraid of him. And he began, that night, to teach her the rifle the way he had taught her everything, by handing it to her and letting her fail until she didn't. He stood behind her in the cold, bright meadow and taught her the breathing of it, the slow squeeze, the way you do not fight the kick but let it come. And her first shots went wide, and her healing shoulder ached, and she set her jaw and tried again. By the 4th day, she could put a ball through a marten hide pegged to a far snag 3 times running. The day she did it clean, she lowered the rifle and turned and found him watching her with the half-mended look of a man seeing something he had given up expecting. And she said, "My hands don't shake anymore, and meant a great deal more than the rifle, and he heard all of it, and neither of them looked away. There was a thaw window in the third week of February, a false soft spell when the south faces let go, and the low trail down to Cold Forge opened up muddy and passable for maybe 4 days before it froze shut again, and they took it. They did not take it alone, and that was Ruth's doing, because a woman who keeps accounts knows that one rifle and one hard man against a camp that owes a creditor everything is not a fight. It is a funeral, and she had not come this far to bury Ezra Finch over a line in a book. So on the way down, where the trail passed the played-out diggings, she stopped at the cabins of the men the camp had thrown away. There was old Tom Hatcher, who had broke his back in Drew's diggings and been turned out of the company shack the week he could no longer swing a pick. There was the widow Siles, whose husband had died the same fever as Daniel owing Drew the same kind of grubstake, and who had been bound over to 2 years' laundry to settle it and hated the man with a clean cold flame. There was a packer named Baptiste, who Drew had cheated on a freight contract, and who would, he said, walk a mile to spit downwind of the man. And there were the diggers, a dozen of them, who had stood in that store in the autumn and looked at their boots while a woman was sold, and who had not had a clean night's sleep about it since. Because there is nothing a man hates worse than the memory of his own silence. Ruth did not ask them to fight. She was too smart for that, and too honest. She asked them to witness. He's going to stand up in front of the recorder, she told them, in Hatcher's smoky dugout with the thaw dripping outside, and say I'm a thief who ran from a debt, so the claim's forfeit. But I've got the paper that says the debt was paid in full, in cash, in front of all of you, in that store. He can buy a recorder. He can't buy 40 memories at once if 40 memories decide to stand up. That's all I'm asking. When he lies, you remember out loud. You don't have to draw a gun. You just have to stop looking at your boots. It was the widow Siles who stood up first, in that dugout, and said, I watched him sell you, and I've hated my own face in the glass ever since. I'll come, and I'll remember loud as you like. And then it was Hatcher, and Baptiste, and then the diggers, because Ruth Calloway had given them the one thing Silas Drew never had, which was a way to stop being ashamed. They came down into Cold Forge the next morning, a slow, ragged procession of the camp's discarded with a widow and a child, and a mountain man at the head of it, and the camp came out of its shacks and saloons to see, because nothing draws a frontier town like the smell of a reckoning. Silas Drew met them on the porch of the Mercantile, because of course he did. Because a man who does his work in front of crowds is never more dangerous than when he thinks the crowd is his. He had the recorder beside him, a soft, nervous clerk with ink-stained cuffs, and the camp deputy on his other side with a star and a shotgun, and the careful blank face of a man hoping no one will ask to see the conscience he sold. And 4 hard men spread loose along the porch rail, hands near their belts, the kind a creditor keeps for the accounts that don't settle on paper. Drew looked at the crowd at Ruth's back, and the smile he wore did not reach the cold arithmetic behind his eyes. Mrs. Calloway, he said, pleasant, pitched for everyone. You've saved me the trouble of sending for you. There's the matter of a forfeited estate. You absconded from a lawful debt. The debt was paid. Ruth's voice carried clean across the muddy street, steadier than she had any right to expect, and she felt the man beside her, the silent, scarred bulk of him, not move and not speak, and somehow fill the whole space behind her like a wall she could lean on without touching, paid in full, in cash money, in that store in front of every man here, by Mr. Ezra Finch, the 3rd week of October. Your own storekeeper weighed the dust. Your own hand wrote it in your own book and turned it for the camp to see. So I never absconded from any debt, Mr. Drew, because by the time I left this camp there was no debt to abscond from. We were square. You said so yourself, to the whole town. A murmur went through the crowd, low and growing. The sound of 40 men remembering the same thing at the same time. Drew's smile thinned. The estate remained encumbered at the time of "Show them the book." Ezra Finch spoke for the first time, and his flat, scraped voice fell on the crowd like a dropped stone. "You've got it inside. You wrote in it for everybody to see in the autumn. Bring it out. Turn to the Callaway page. Read it to them. Out loud. The way you made everybody watch you do it the first time." It was the trap, and Drew saw it close. He could not produce the book that said paid in full in his own hand and then in the same breath claim the debt had still been owing. And he could not refuse to produce it. Not with 40 men who had watched him brandish it now staring and waiting, because a man cannot hide his holy book from the congregation without admitting it was only ever a prop. The silence stretched, and Ruth watched him understand he had been beaten with his own favorite weapon. So he reached, the way such men always reach at the end, past the law he had pretended to serve, for the gun he had always actually relied on. "She's a thief and a runaway," he said, dropping all the pleasantness at last, his voice gone flat and ugly, "and there's a star here says so. Take her." And he nodded to the deputy and the 4 hard men along the rail. The deputy did not move. He looked at the crowd, and the crowd looked back, and somewhere in the front of it old Tom Hatcher said, "Clear and carrying. You'll have to come through me. And I worked 30 years in this camp," and the widow Siles stepped up beside him, and Baptiste, and then the diggers, not drawing anything. Just stepping. Just closing in a slow, ragged wall between the porch and the woman. Every one of them done at last with looking at their boots. The 4 hard men looked at 40 witnesses and at the mountain of a man whose hand had come to rest, unhurried, on the rifle slung across his chest, and did the arithmetic hired men always do, which is that no wage is worth being the one who fires into a crowd that has finally stopped being afraid. And Silas Drew, who had built an empire on the certainty that frightened people stay frightened and discarded people stay quiet, and the law is whatever the man with the ledger says it is, stood alone on his own porch and watched all 3 certainties fail him at once. It was the recorder who finished it, the soft clerk with the ink-stained cuffs. He cleared his throat in the ringing silence and said, not to Drew but to the crowd, in the prim, careful voice of a man suddenly very anxious to be on record as having done the lawful thing, "The book does say paid in full. I've seen it. If the debt was satisfied in October, there was no encumbered estate when the widow departed, and no forfeiture lies." He swallowed. "The relocation filing is void. The original claim stands. In the name of Daniel Callaway, and—" he looked at the paper, and then at Ruth, and then he said it loud enough for the whole camp, "and Ruth Callaway, his wife." Recorded and proved. Hers, Ruth Callaway, stood in the mud of the camp that had tried to sell her, and heard her own name read out as an owner, and not a debt, in front of the same 40 men who had once watched her be priced like flour. And she did not weep, and she did not gloat. She had thought, in the long planning of it up in the cabin, that the moment would feel like triumph. It did not. It felt like a thing being set straight that should never have been crooked, like a line drawn through a lie. She looked at Silas Drew, alone on his porch with his prop of a ledger useless inside, and his hired men finding other places to look, and found she had nothing to say to him at all, which was its own kind of victory. The discovery that he had never once been large enough to deserve her hate, only her opposition. "We're square, Mr. Drew," she said quietly, the same words he had used to sell her, handed back, "paid in full. The book says so. You made very sure everyone saw it." And she turned her back on him and walked back through the ragged wall of the camp's cast-offs, who parted for her and closed behind her. And Ezra Finch walked at her shoulder with the rifle loose in his hand and never once looked back at the man on the porch. because the man on the porch had stopped, somewhere in the last 5 minutes, being worth the turning of a head. They did not stay in Cold Forge. Ruth had not taken the claim back to work it. She had taken it back to cross out the line. She sold it to a mining company down from Helena that wanted the proved seam and paid in honest bank paper, and the sum of it was more money than either of them had ever stood near. Enough for the clean place with the creek that Daniel had promised and never lived to give. But the selling was not the point. The point was that it was hers to sell, and that the line was crossed out. In front of everyone. They were married in the spring, when the high passes opened, in a plain church in the valley town on the far side of the Bitterroot, and Ruth Calloway wore the lace. She had finished it in the last weeks at the cabin, the stitches coming back to her ruined, hardened hands, not fine and effortless the way they had been at 16, but slower and surer, the work of a woman instead of a girl. And where the old thread had snagged on her new calluses, she had learned to mind the calluses instead of cursing them. It was a harder, plainer, truer thing than the lace she would have made for the wedding that never happened, and she understood as she pinned it on that she had finished it at last not for Daniel and not for a child, but for herself. Because Daniel had told her to, in the letter, "Finish your lace, girl. We're going to need it." And she had needed it, only not for the reason either of them had thought. Nell stood up beside her, 12 going on a hard 1:30, and old Hatcher came down out of the hills for it, and the widow Siles, and Baptiste with a pair of beaded gauntlets for the bride, and Ezra Finch stood at the front of that plain church in a clean coat that did not fit him, and when the parson asked him the question, the man who had refused for one whole winter to make a sound that could be mistaken for tenderness, who had paid a fortune to make sure a woman owed him nothing so that whatever came after would be freely given or not at all, looked at her and said the one word he had been saving, plain and rough and full, his whole voice his own: "I do." And later, much later, on the porch of the clean place with the creek that they bought with Daniel's silver and built with their own 4 hands, there hung 2 things on a nail by the door where another house might have hung a horseshoe or a cross. One was her mother's thimble, on its bootlace that had pressed cold against her sternum the day she was sold and the day she took it all back. The other was a small framed square of the wedding lace, the rest folded away in a cedar box for the child that did, in those mended years, finally come. And on the evenings when the light went long and gold over the Bitterroot peaks and Ezra was laid in off the High Line, Ruth Calloway would step out onto the porch of the home no man owned a piece of and watch the tree line for the big, scarred shape of him coming home. A man who had taught a sold woman that the largest thing anyone can do for another is to make sure they never have to pay it back. And a woman who had taught a man who quit on people that the silence was only ever meant to be the place you healed and not the place you hid. A debt is the easiest lie there is to tell about a person, because it comes dressed as a number, and a number looks like the truth. Silas Drew spent a fortune of other men's labor and the better part of his life learning to write people down as debts in a leather book, and he was good at it, and it worked. Right up until the day a woman he'd priced at $60 in dust stood in the mud and made him read his own book out loud, and the camp remembered all at once that a person was never a number. And a number was never the law, and the law was never his. So here is what I'll leave you with, and I'd honestly like to know what you think, because I read every last one of these. Ruth Calloway believed for most of her life that every kindness was a loan and every loan came due, that the only safe way to live was to owe no one and be owed by no one, and it took a scarred, silent man who refused to be paid back to teach her that the truest things in this life can't be entered in any book at all. So tell me, honest, do you believe the wise thing, the safe thing, is to keep the accounts square, to take nothing you can't repay so no one ever has a hold on you, the way Ruth tried to live, Or do you believe, the way Ezra did, that the one thing that ever truly saves us is being brave enough to give something freely, and braver still to let somebody give it to you? Tell me which one you've lived, down in the comments. And so the lamp goes dim in the high cabin while the snow keeps falling. Stay warm, stay a while, and I'll see you up the pass next week.